Today on Stronger Than Reason, we get Muy Misterioso with Houston's own prolific outsider legend, Jandek. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So, I want to start this episode with a confession. See, I used to do improv, not improv nights at college, although those were in fact a thing way back when, and I did attend from time to time, though I never participated. In fact, that was where I heard one of the funniest lines ever delivered in context, which was this: "Can I pay by the foot?" And no, I'm not providing the context, but trust me, it killed. The improv I did was musical, and no, it wasn't jazz. The idea was simply this. A buddy and I would gather in the bunker a couple of times a week, hook up a ridiculous number of musical boxes of various sorts, preferably the kind that had a lot of dials and buttons and blinking lights, the more the better. And it was better yet if we constantly mixed up the equipment, selling this to buy that and so on, and rearranging everything in strange new ways, always keeping it fresh. And we'd plug all this crap into a mixer and run that thing into a recorder and just go to town for an hour, just browning out the whole neighborhood. Anything was fair game as long as it wasn't a PC or a phone or a tablet running any sort of software. The rule was it had to be hardware of some sort. So think of drum machines, keyboards, effects boxes, samplers, microphones, and gadgets of all sorts. And we went through a lot of unique and strange gear over the years that we did this. Roland Hansonics played a big part. The Korg Chaosillator had an importance that cannot be overstated, and its big brother, the KP3, which is a weird mashup of sampler, 4-track recorder, and effects unit. And at one point, we had a Tenori On, which is this sort of boutique synth and sequencer thing. Lots of different keyboards and synths. We had Moger Fogers. Let's see. At one point, I had a Suzuki Omnichord. For a while, we had dueling Roland guitar synths. That was probably my favorite part, in fact. Some of the stuff that we came up with around that time was really wild, and it sounded like nothing else I've heard before or since. And that was it, really. We would just record everything that happened, and we'd usually play for an hour or so in any given night. And, later, the next day or so, I'd come up with the cover art, which, of course, had to follow a distinct, unified look. And that would just go right out on our website. And I think we even ran this idea as a podcast for a few years way back when on iTunes. So you could even subscribe to it and get an hour or so of this semi-ambient electronic improv delivered right to your device. And I gotta say, looking back on that, well, for one thing, yes, we were kind of nuts, and it was definitely an obsession for a while. But it was also really fun and freeing. I just remember having such a good time because anything could happen during those sessions. And yeah, of course, maybe 80% of it was just us faffing about. But I'd argue that there are some real gems buried in there, stuff that we would never have come up with in any other way. Like when you're staring down the barrel of an empty session in your digital audio workstation, and you just start going through the motions, like, oh, I need a beat. Okay, I need some bass. Now I need some rhythm guitar, etc., etc. And before you know it, you've just created a pretty formulaic track. And the improv stuff was entirely unlike that. Some of it was just really out there and nuts. It really allowed us to explore the bigger landscape of what was possible musically than we could by taking a more traditional approach. And even though we ended up making 9 albums of proper music since then, and counting, I do consider some of those improv sessions to be among the best things that we ever did. And that feeling I got when something magical would happen, it was so great that it more than made up for the times when nothing seemed to come together. And in fact, I still do kind of like the idea of that way of working, just trying to break out of any preconceived workflow, making music in the moment without micro-tweezing various parts and so on. But it did present a problem. and that was this. What was it we were actually doing? Were these sessions albums? Should they be marketed as such, or was it something else? Something more ephemeral, less official. And at the time, I didn't really know of any other obvious musical projects that were doing exactly what we were doing. We weren't writing songs or performing the same pieces over and over. It was just something that was different every time. And in fact, we probably couldn't have recreated any of these things even if we had wanted to without completely rebuilding it anyway, because we were just constantly mixing all these different sources in all these crazy paths, mixing everything down to stereo on the fly. There were no separate tracks or anything. And neither were either of us paying attention to things like what settings or patches we were using. All of this stuff just came out of nowhere, really, instinctively, and it just wound up on tape. It could never be perfectly replicated. There were mistakes and all, and there were plenty of mistakes. So for years, we struggled with things like MIDI sync. So in theory, one of our loopers would act as the master for the entire rig. But in fact, the loopers we chose to use were never great at that sort of thing, and we used various ones over the years. So we'd frequently have a situation where stuff was going out of sync after just a minute or so with no real way to resync it. But in a way, we ended up working around that. That was a good thing because it kept us from leaving loops running too long and having things get boring. So we were forced to change things up a lot to keep things moving and in sync. And one thing that was exhilarating about that was that it let us produce so much material in such a short time. And it wasn't long before we were just drowning in these recordings. In fact, to this day, there are over 100 hours of them on our website, free to the public now through the Creative Commons license. And I do know at least one case where they were used for a film, which is pretty cool. But the fact that these things were album length was interesting to me. It made me think, what if there were a band that produced hundreds of albums? What would that be like? I mean, we could certainly claim these things were albums, and maybe they weren't great albums with particular songs that we, labored over. But, that aspect of it is largely hidden from the consumer unless the artist decides to share the method of production. And for all someone knew, maybe we had labored over these things. Who would know? It's all just product that's coming out regularly. Much like this podcast, now that I think about it. So what do you think? How much effort do you think I put into a typical episode of Stronger Than Reason? Would you say I'm just winging it, just talking off the cuff, improvising? Or do you think I painstakingly write out the whole thing, or, somewhere in between? And I'm almost afraid to ask that question, but I am kind of curious what you think. How much time do you suppose goes into making one of these here episodes? Just laying out the thoughts, recording it, the post-production and all that. Just curious to know. Anyway, back in the day, when we were doing this improv stuff, it occurred to me that this might be a good approach for a band in general. Just record a new album every week, why not? Attention spans are shorter than ever these days. People just want content and lots of it. They don't really want to hear some song more than a dozen times anyway, even if it's great. So why spend months perfecting a single song? You could just improv up a dozen or so albums in that time. There's bound to be something in there that someone would like if they want to sift through it. Most people are just streaming anyway. They're not buying your music and putting it on a shelf anymore so much. They're not getting a particular relationship with that particular piece of music like they used to. Streams are inherently ephemeral. They come and they go. So in that spirit, I thought, why not stream the music's creation as well as its consumption? In other words, stop creating music in batch mode and create instead in real time. Just put everything out there. Your brainstorming, the idea generation, record everything. Just call it all an album, or don't call it an album. I mean, who really cares? The important thing is keep the content coming. Don't let the listener get bored. Throw in some metal guitar. Why not? Maybe try some live drumming. I know, keytars. Or try some video, more in stranger effects. Just mash up your instruments in novel ways. run your guitar through the drum machine and gate the output, or run a shortwave radio through the aux input in the keyboard. Make a bunch of really strange synth patches, and believe me, with enough delay and reverb, even the most annoying synth patch becomes usable. So that's what we did for a few years anyway, before I guess the spell wore off and we got tired of doing the same thing every week. And then we shifted gears and started making proper albums and started playing live, etc., until even that kind of got old. And to tell the truth, I still think the idea of creating a ridiculous amount of content is an underutilized model for a modern band. And, I'm kind of psyching myself up into it again. The more I talk about it here, the more I'm wondering why we ever stopped. I think it was Brian Eno who once said that you don't have to paint as well as Da Vinci or Dali or Monet to make art that astounds people. Sometimes all you need is patience doing anything for a very long time. Okay, so the example he gave was if you were a visual artist whose hook was just filling in vast areas with a simple number 2 pencil. That's it. So sure, it would take you hours and hours and hours and hours, and maybe it wasn't technically challenging, but the sheer scale of it would be mind-blowing. I mean, who else is doing that? It's an example of an extreme, right? And it certainly is valid as art. People are going to respond to it in some way, kind of like they respond to some modern art, I would think. Maybe they're only angry about it, but they're responding. And that's what art is about. It's about provoking some kind of response in the viewer or listener, whatever someone might think of its merits or lack thereof. So there is something, I think, to be said for just sheer quantity, because let's face it, quality is a value judgment, but you can't argue with quantity. If you have a ton of a thing, it's a ton, and that's it. No one can dispute it. So as I was thinking these sorts of thoughts back in the day, feeling pretty clever and happy about this strange niche that we had fallen into, around that time, I'd say I happened to stumble on at least one other act that was doing something along those lines, or so I thought. And I don't mean improv necessarily, because I really had no idea what this guy was doing to create his music. All I know was that there was a lot of it. So I was browsing Wikipedia one night, which, as you all know, is the next best thing to learning something. And I happened to wind up on a page about a so-called outsider band. Now, what does that term mean, outsider? I mean, you often hear about outsider artists, and generally it refers to people who are operating outside of the traditional art industry. So not only do they not have contacts with people in the industry, they're not really following any of the traditional norms of the art itself. In fact, they might not even be aware of those norms. And they're not necessarily trying to, make it in the industry at all. They're just doing this for themselves or for inscrutable reasons. And that's what makes them outsiders. And this particular band was from Houston, Texas, which might give you some preconceived notions about the music style. But trust me, you can throw your preconceived notions out your preconceived window. I saw in Wikipedia that this band had something at the time, like 50 albums, which was pretty stunning, just on the face of it. 50 albums. And in fact, some of them were even multi-disc sets or boxed sets. And they'd been making them since 1978, which was when I was still in elementary school. And a lot of these albums were just that. They were vinyl record albums. But, eventually they'd all get reissued on CD. But, wow, 50 albums. I mean, at the time I had heard of bands like Psychic TV making something like 100 albums. But even then, in 2008 or whatever that was, details on those albums were kind of hard for me to come by. In fact, when I look at the Psychic TV page out on Wikipedia today, it only lists like 40 or so, which, is a lot of albums, but it's not 100. So the sheer volume of material here that I was looking at captured my imagination. But so did something else, because this band was almost a complete mystery. Very little was known about them. They were on a record label called Corwood Industries that evidently only produced music by this one band. And in all their years of activity, they had given precisely one interview, which we'll talk about in a bit. They didn't play live shows, and beyond regularly sending free albums to college radio stations and some very sparse ads in the music mags, they didn't promote themselves, and they gradually grew an audience nevertheless. And I'm saying they a lot here, but really, like with any artistic endeavor of such singular vision, the band was just one person. One guy who evidently didn't want to play the game by the traditional rules, or who maybe wasn't playing a game at all, because the work as a whole, to me, had a sense of desperation about it. Like this was something he just had to do, and he'd been quietly doing it for almost as long as I've been alive. The band, of course, was Jandek, which is actually the name of the musical project, but it's sometimes used interchangeably to mean the guy who's making the music. And that's a little erroneous if we're being technical, and we kind of want to be technical here, because the individual behind it prefers to be known as the representative from Corwood, or the representative for short. And yes, today we are fairly sure that we know this person's full legal name, but you know what? I'm not going to use it here. First, out of respect for his desire to stay out of the spotlight, and second, because I personally prefer the mystery. The mystery is half of what drew me into this thing anyway. Maybe another quarter of it was the cool packaging, which we'll talk about shortly. And maybe the last quarter was just the sheer volume of output, as we discussed. But I hear you asking, that leaves nothing for the music. What about the music? Yes, the music. We will also discuss that shortly. But when I first heard about Jandek in the late 2000s, no one really knew anything about it. So what did we know? Well, many of the album covers depicted the same guy at different ages, from a kid up to what appears to be middle age. And presumably this was the representative himself. But for many years, no one could say for sure. Maybe it was just a close relative. After all, someone had to take all these pictures, right? So maybe the representative was the one behind the camera. We just had no idea. We didn't know. And all of these different album covers shared a few characteristics. They all seemed to be amateur shots with film cameras, the kind of snapshots that family would take of one another in the days before, digital cameras were everywhere. They certainly don't have the 4K image quality we've all become so accustomed to. They're often out of focus, or they're not carefully composed. Some are color, some are black and white. Some show the same subjects as previous covers, or were maybe recropped, or from a different angle, or with different lighting. And some are almost certainly from the same film rolls as previous covers. It's as if Jandek were purposefully thinking, I know I'm going to release hundreds of albums, so it hardly matters what's on each cover. So, the covers themselves kind of tell a story. They evidently depict one person's life or aspects of it, ranging back to the 60s to the present day. And, maybe at this point it's best to introduce an example. I was so curious that I ordered a CD right away because I had to have one of these things in my hand to investigate it myself. So I figured I'd start at the beginning. I went on Corwood's website, and yes, they had a website at that point, primitive as it was, and I ordered the first Jandek album, which was 1978's Ready for the House, which you can see here. And this is maybe the most studied of all Jandek albums due to it being the first. You can see the cover happens to be in color, and it depicts what looks like a 60s era living room. You can see the corner of a blue couch. Strangely enough, I just got rid of a couch that looked almost exactly like this. But it's up against a wall painted light blue, next to a window with pink trim and a yellow blind, which is drawn. And there's a little round wooden table with a vase of red flowers and some books on it. And there's another book propped against the window blind, which fans have identified as the Delphi edition of the complete works of Christopher Marlowe, a 16th century English playwright and poet. Maybe an inspiration for Jandek? Who knows? There's also an ashtray in the couch's arm, and all of this is set on a dark blue carpet. And that's it on the cover. Not much to go on. I do like the composition, though, and the colors. It's also very 60s. I also love that there is no type on the cover at all. There's no band name, no album name, which is true of all of Jandek's covers. In fact, I don't think I'd have liked Jandek as much if the covers hadn't been just simple photos, because there's something just so casual and clean about it, and I think it's really compelling. However, we see the spine here gives us the necessary info, if you can read that. I don't know if you can read that. It says Jandek ready for the house, and it also gives us the catalog number, Corwood 0739. So this is the first Corwood released, so that number must be meaningful in some way, but no one knows what that is except the representative. And then we have the back as well. All of his albums follow the same packaging template, with very few exceptions. Again, this is an example of what Frank Zappa described as conceptual continuity. So all of the works have a through line in having a similar design. And, as we discussed over the year and a half here, this is an idea that bands like KMFDM would adopt as well, giving credit to Frank, of course. But Jandek did the same thing, and as to whether he's a Zappa fan or not, I really can't say. Maybe it was just more of an instinct of his to do things the same way every time. But, 140 albums later, Jandek albums still look like this. And you see we have the song list here and the track lengths. And down in the bottom left, the copyright info for Corwood Industries, P.O. Box 15375 in Houston. Now, I'm a wee bit familiar with Houston because I have some close family there, and I know the zip code is located pretty far downtown. So I'm thinking maybe the next time I go there, I'll make a pilgrimage to this post office box and, I don't know, just take a picture of it. So, let's open this up, this package. And there's not much to go on here. The info on the back is just replicated here in the back of the front panel, and it is just a single panel of paper. It's not a booklet. Then we have the disc itself, which is white text on a shiny, translucent blue. And this is a real CD, by the way. This is not a CDR of the sort that would be common coming from like disc makers and so on in a few years. The art's actually screen printed on. And in fact, if you look at the back of the disc, I don't know if you can see this, but the hub actually says Corwood-0739 there in the middle. So it's definitely not a CDR. Of course, this record was first released in 1978 on vinyl only. In fact, all the releases were vinyl only until 1994, when the 23rd album, Graven Image, came out only on CD. So that and some of the other later Jandek albums were never released on vinyl, to my knowledge. I don't think it's possible to have a complete vinyl-only collection of his work. So yeah, this is what I received in a padded mailer that was handwritten, and it had my name and address on it, of course. And you know what, folks? I kept that mailer because I have a strange feeling in my gut that it was written by the representative himself, and I kind of wanted to keep it as a souvenir. And obviously I can't show that on camera, but trust me, it's really cool. And I'm guessing that you can get one of your own by ordering a Jandek album yourself. Try it and see. It also contained a photocopied Corwood Catalog, charmingly hand-typed with somewhat cryptic ordering instructions. And, looking at this still gives me chills because I kind of touched on why that is in episode 26. It was the first one I did about the Magnetic Fields album 69 Love Songs. There's something about typewritten text that really speaks to me because I think it's DIY in a way that makes it seem like whatever this thing is I'm looking at, I could do it too. The packaging on 69 Love Songs used that extensively, and of course that was another album that reveled somewhat in the sheer volume of content, right? 69 songs is a lot for an album. Well, here we have nearly 60-some albums listed, not just songs. So, Stephen Merritt has some work to do to catch up to Jandek's output. Anyway, looking at this, I did feel a resonance of sorts with my band's own improv project. I mean, if we treated each of our hour-long sessions as an album, we would kind of be in this ballpark. All we'd need would be some clever album titles and perhaps song titles, and we'd be in business. And that was inspiring to think about, that any band could just produce so much work, because it implies a few things. For one, any specific piece of that work becomes less important just by comparison to the whole, right? I mean, for example, if I release 100 albums, each with an average of, say, 8 songs, any one song becomes less important, and it becomes more about the work as a whole than it does that one song. And I just think that's freeing in a big way. It means I can take less time worrying about any specific aspect of a song and just create freely. I think about the hours of my life that I've personally spent micro-tweezing my music, and it makes me just reconsider all of that. Like, what's the point? It almost is certainly the case that I spend weeks perfecting a track, making it just right, and for what? So someone can listen to the first 10 seconds on Spotify or whatever and just skip it. Or maybe listen to it once or twice and go, it's pretty good, and never listen to it again. So it really got me thinking about the wisdom of lingering over your art, especially in this day and age when art is so eminently disposable. I mean, that's a cynical take, but let's be real. In fact, last night, my older son, unprompted, described recorded music as being a loss leader. And he's completely on point, because that's Gen Z's expectation, that recorded music is essentially cost-free, and that an artist has to rely on live tickets and merch sales to make any money. And I'm sure that most Gen Z folks would agree with that. I mean, that's their lived experience. That's what the music industry these days has in fact become. And it spurred this conversation about just getting music out there, or whatever it is, which, that was my take. And then my younger son aptly summed it up as, oh, you mean quantity over quality. And I guess that's true to a point. It's probably true, in fact. But the thing is, and this is an important point that we covered in episode 50, the one about making music. Quantity, like I said, is by definition quantitative. It's objective, whereas quality is entirely subjective. It strongly depends on the individual who's making the judgment. And that's the rub, folks. And that's what's going to lead us into our discussion of Jandek's actual music, not just the coolness of the mystery of the whole thing and the nifty packaging. But what about the music? And I'm sure you're wondering, is it any good? Well, I have my own opinions on that, but they're only mine. Ultimately, you're going to have to listen for yourself and make your own call. And the thing is, that's true of any band I've ever talked about on here. You can never take my word for it or anyone's word for it where quality is concerned. After all, the entire world might hate something, but it might speak to something in you, and you might think it's the most brilliant thing ever. And no one has a right to second guess you on that. After all, they're not you, and they can't say how you're responding to any piece of art, and they can't tell you how you feel about it. And you shouldn't let the world at large influence your own tastes. And, obviously different people will often have different opinions about what's good or bad. But regardless of my own opinions about Jandek's music, there are many, many people who love it, who've collected it all, who follow his every move closely. And, you can't discount that, even if you don't personally care for it. Now, are all these people really responding to the music, or are they responding to the mystery? I personally think it's probably a mix of both, really. I think one probably feeds the other. The mystery certainly helps for sure, but then there are people who will listen to nearly anything and genuinely get off on it. I mean, the Conet Project, for instance, and for more on that, see episode 55, or, Panic at the Disco, or the Arctic Monkeys. I mean, ew, there's no accounting for taste. So let's talk about the music here for a bit. And I'm not going to try to do a track by track because I think it's almost pointless in this case because there's very little variation between these songs to my ears. And in fact, from what I've heard of the first several Jandek albums, they all have undeniable sameness to them. Although, eventually he would start to mess with that formula, as all artists tend to do over time. So if you drop the needle on Ready for the House, what do you hear? And I'm going to try to describe it to you as best I can, And this reminds me, someone asked me recently, why don't you actually play clips of these bands you're talking about in your show? And, I would love to, folks. I really would. But the fact is, I just can't because, I had to go into the whole explanation about YouTube, copyright strikes and all. And, I'm sensitive to people using artists' material with their permission as opposed to without their permission. And, I suppose I could try to put some clips in there and I probably would get away with it. But I think it's less hassle for me over time to just avoid that whole scene. I don't want to put a ton of effort into this show only to get an episode taken down because some label decides to be a jerk or some lawyer or whatever. I figure if you want to hear these bands I'm talking about, they're all just a click away anyway. I don't have to spoon feed you. It's all on YouTube these days for free or on Spotify if you're paying for that. So yeah, that's why I don't bother with that. Anyway, the first track obviously here is called Naked in the Afternoon, which I can immediately relate to. Eventually you hear some very lo-fi guitar strumming that seems to be pretty out of tune. And soon enough you hear some male vocals, which also seem to be pretty out of tune. And over all of that is a thin layer of reverb, but not very much. And, the highlight here in listening to this for me is maybe the lyrics and the vocal delivery. And the lyrics are pretty abstract, but they seem to be drawn from things that happen to this guy. Kind of, everyday things. So in a way, it's bluesy in feel, at least philosophically, because it sounds like an exorcism of sorts, as blues music is. Someone working out their troubles or their experiences by releasing them through music. So when you go to track 2, which is called First You Think Your Fortune's Lovely, it sounds just like more of the same thing, like the same song. It's the same guitar, detuned in the same way. It's the same male vocal with more or less the same cadence. And so it goes, really. And that's the whole album. You're not going to hear him suddenly playing other chords or using other instruments. So you might ask, is this even music? And I'd say so, certainly, though it has nothing to do with the pop-oriented music we're so used to hearing. And it has little to do with anything like modern expectations of melody, harmony, or rhythm. Some might call this experimental music, but I think that's kind of pretentious. I don't think it's that calculated. I think this is one guy who's just doing his thing, and he's not worrying too much about what bin it's going to fall in. And that means there's something pure about it. To me, this sounds like someone bearing his soul. There's no artifice about it. There's no desire to build it into something it's not. And it's not even that pretty in a way. It's not pretty in a conventional way. To me, it's definitely listenable in the same way that the Conet Project is listenable. And maybe for the same reason. It's because I'm responding to the music emotionally. It's visceral. And sure, I might not want to listen to it for the same reasons that I listen to other kinds of music, but it undeniably puts me in a certain kind of headspace. And sometimes it's just what the doctor ordered. Now, do I really want to listen to 100 albums of this? Speaking for myself? Probably not. In fact, this is the only Jandek album I own so far. I've listened to others online. But do I think this fills a certain niche in my collection? Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad to own it, if not only for the audio content, as an artifact of this project that I admire for, a variety of reasons. So I mentioned, though, that Jandek would soon tinker with this formula, and he did that in later albums by introducing some other instrumentation and some collaborators. As far as I know, none of those folks were credited, to my knowledge, except indirectly in song titles like Nancy Sings. There are albums with drums, with electric guitars, piano, and other stuff, but not a lot of what you'd call traditional songs. Not a lot of verse, chorus, verse, pop hooks, to say the least. This is just a guy venting his spleen in a systematic way. You know, another couple albums every year or so, just as a way of life. And, you know, that's how things rambled on for a few years until the representative agreed to do a phone interview with rock journalist John Trubee in 1985. And this interview is on YouTube, naturally, and I urge you to check it out as a primary source if you're intrigued by Jandek at all. And in it, the representative sounds like a level-headed, normal, and nice guy. He's very polite. He just happens to have this side gig making this enigmatic music on his enigmatic label. And in the interview, he does speak to some of the mechanics of what he's doing. For instance, that he had all the records pressed cheaply in Houston, generally in batches of 300 at a time, and he'd regularly mail them out to college radio stations where he'd occasionally enjoy some airplay. But, you know, at the time of the interview, this is 7 years after he had started releasing these albums, he said that he had only sold something like 140 records in all. And at that point, it just hadn't really caught on. So imagine that for a minute. He had 9 or so albums out at that point, and had personally paid to press hundreds of copies of each, maybe mailing 40 or so out to radio stations. And that's thousands of records he was having to store somewhere that were unsold, you know, in the days before storage units were super common. And, you know, he mentions in the interview that his day job was something like a machinist. Actually, I think Trubee mentions that, and the representative just doesn't deny it. So, you know, in my imagination, I'm thinking of a guy with a pretty decent job and, you know, who knows, maybe not a family to take care of. Maybe he's a young, unmarried guy, a guy with some disposable income, and he chooses to spend it on making his own record label, you know, not one of these modern day so-called labels where a guy buys a $15 domain name and throws some music on it and calls it a label, or maybe if he's lazy, just throws up a Bandcamp page and calls it a label. I mean, what kind of complete moron would do a thing like that? I'm talking about getting thousands of vinyl records pressed and, you know, paying to ship them all over the country to bemused record stations, and just doing that over and over for years without any recognition. You know, after 7 years, not even selling 200 records in total. That was less than just one order's worth. And, you know, there was some other information in there. The representative actually mentions an early review of his that said, "May he never tune his guitar." And he took time to point out that he does tune it. He just doesn't tune it to any sort of standard tuning. He's just tuning it so it sounds good to him, period. which is pretty great. He just clearly doesn't give a damn. He's just happy doing his own thing. But the really amazing thing to me is how he just has kept on doing it. He's unfazed. There's definitely something motivating him. This is not a person who started a band or a label as a vanity project, hoping it would catch on and then just bailing when it inevitably failed. This is a person who's driven to do it because he has to, because there is no other option. Making this music the way he does and, you know, getting it out there, it's the only way to scratch the itch, to find some kind of satisfaction. And maybe it's the same kind of thing where people just write journals every day for years and years. You know, as I said in episode 50, writing a novel is easy in a way. You just have to write 2,000 words a day for 1 month. That's it. And at the end of the month, you'll have a literary work of some sort that is novel length. And whether it's any good or not, that's a completely separate question. And again, it's a subjective one. But getting it done is simply a matter of sitting down and writing, of doing the work. And Jandek has been doing the work day in and day out for almost 50 years now. And that's why he's got 100 plus albums. And apart from anything else, you have to admire that work ethic, the sheer craft of it. I mean, not only is he writing the lyrics, and he did tell Trubee that he typically writes about 70% and improvises the rest, but he's setting up the recordings, using his own reel-to-reel recorder, recording the tracks. He's coordinating with all the other musicians who are involved. He's taking photos. He's doing packaging. He's picking the right photos for the cover. He's dealing with the logistics of getting records or CDs or DVDs pressed to his specifications. And not to mention that he's managing a mail order business that I imagine grew quite a bit following that interview. And he's done this over and over and over since the late 70s. And I think there's a lesson there for all of us about playing the long game, for embracing discipline and building that castle one brick at a time. You know, the merits of doing it as Eno said and filling in vast areas with a number 2 pencil rather than learning to draw like Rembrandt. Sometimes the sheer scale of the work can be as inspiring to listeners as the content itself, and sometimes it can be more important. So as I said, I stumbled upon Jandek in the late 2000s, and a few things had rocked the world of Jandek around that time. And maybe the first one was expected because someone finally produced a documentary called Jandek on Corwood. So director Chad Friedrichs released it in 2003. The representative was not in it. He wasn't interviewed for it, but it did feature plenty of interviews with contemporary music journalists and critics. So some pretty neat stuff. And again, it's available on YouTube, and I urge you to check it out if you're interested. It's about 90 or so minutes long, and it'll give you a lot of food for thought about the relationship between an artist and their audience. And I think it does a great job of summing up the mystery and allure of Jandek up to that point. But the next thing that happened was completely unexpected, almost unfathomable, and I suspect it made many a Jandek fan question everything they thought they knew, because he started performing live shows in public in front of actual crowds. And this first happened in October 2004, when the representative, who was clearly the same gentleman from the album covers, although, of course, somewhat older, played a show in Glasgow without being announced or identified at all. Yet who else could this be? He was on stage in all black with an electric guitar next to a bassist and a drummer, and they played something akin to free jazz, except it was more like free rock. And of course, by the time I had found out about this, it was all over YouTube, and of course I watched as much of it as I could, just fascinated that this guy not only came out of his shell, but he went halfway around the world to do it. And you just had to admire that and wonder what he was thinking, taking it to this next level. And naturally, once the seal was broken, more shows followed. To date, he's played nearly 100 shows, according to Setlist FM, 2 of which were this year in 2024. So he's still out there doing it. Maybe you can catch him sometime. And he's getting all sorts of people to play with him. In fact, I recently caught one of his shows online where he had Mike Watt of the Minutemen and Firehose and, countless other bands up there playing bass. And this wasn't a recent show. I think it was from 2013 in Houston. And I was really amazed by that set because Mike, of course, started to lay down some funk towards the end. And, Jandek kept right up, even when it got downright groovy, almost like dance music. So yeah, I guess his live concerts can cover a pretty wide stylistic range. Another thing that I noticed in one of his shows that I thought was super cool was his guitar. He had a proper fretless guitar. It was not a fretless bass. It was an acoustic electric fretless guitar, and it didn't even have fret markings. And I was like, oh, of course, that makes total sense. If anyone doesn't need fret markings, it's the representative, right? So yeah, I thought that was really cool. I'd just never seen a fretless guitar like that before. And, he continued to evolve and change and surprise in some ways. Some albums would have more female vocals or even what sounded like synths and strings. Some of them sounded kind of orchestral even, with lots of different acoustic instruments. 2012's Maze of the Phantom gets kind of wild in that regard. And then, he'd dial it all back again. He'd release a bunch of albums that were just his voice with no instrumentation at all. Just strip it way back to the bare bones, just spoken word, really. So yeah, it's always an adventure. So why do I love Jandek? Well, I think I love the idea of Jandek more than the music per se, if I'm being honest. The thing I like about him the most is just his dogged persistence. It comes back for me to that Corwood album catalog. And to this day, you can go out to corwoodindustries.com and look at it, check it out. It's a testament to building a body of work, of being creative in a disciplined way, day in and day out, not in a glorified way, but more of a work a day sort of way. And, I can't help but make me think of other things in life, things that normally take a lot of time, but nevertheless can be whittled away at. Like, what if I had stuck with karate from back in high school? Well, by now I'd probably be a black belt several times over, wouldn't I? I just would have had to put in that time. Or what if I had stayed with my studies? I'd probably be a PhD for sure, with tons of research to my name, and I'd surely have pushed human knowledge forward in some way. Or what if I had kept up writing 2,000 words a day just this year as I had initially planned? I'd, by the mathematics, would have 4 more novels under my belt by now. So, alas, that one didn't happen, partially because of this damn podcast, which eats up my time. But yeah, I really find his work ethic inspiring. And in a way, it does take me back to those crazy days 15 years ago when we were obsessively recording in the bunker, just pumping out hours of performance. We were doing the work and just happened to be releasing all of it without a filter because we could, because web server space was cheap and it was fun for me at the time to make all those album covers. And because there was something satisfying about watching the number of sessions grow and grow and grow. And in the back of my mind, maybe, wondering when it would stop, under what circumstances. And, every now and then we do talk about doing that again, but I'm wondering if times have just changed. We're quite a bit older in different situations. I'm not sure it would ever really be the same. Being up all night in a dark room surrounded by blinking gear, headphones on, just listening and responding and listening and responding and just creating new soundscapes on the fly, and every now and then truly capturing lightning in a bottle. And, thinking about it, we almost certainly weren't the greatest band in the world. Maybe we were, I don't know. But we were probably in the top 5% in terms of having produced the most stuff. And just imagine for a second if we had kept that going for these past 15 years. By my calculations, we'd have over 1,000 so-called albums by now, and I'd probably be paying a fortune just to host them all online. We'd probably have to come up with another solution. But, there are very few acts I can think of that might even compete with that, strictly in terms of scale. And one act that does come close is one I'm surprised I haven't mentioned much, and that's Buckethead. He's got just 30 or so proper solo albums, but in 2011, 3 years after my band started the Improv thing, he began releasing mini albums, and he called these pikes for whatever reason, and some of the cover art suggested, to me anyway, that they were supposed to be released regularly like comic books because they had the little issue number box in the upper left corner, if you know what I mean, like a comic book. And, each was about 30 minutes long, like a very short album. Presumably they all have unique songs. I certainly haven't listened to them all. But talk about a guy putting in the work, Buckethead might have even surpassed Jandek in terms of minutes. If you laid all his recordings end to end, it's probably several months of face-melting solos. Now, how much time Buckethead puts into each of these recordings, whether they're all improv or what, I definitely can't say. Maybe somebody here can tell us. But it's that same idea, right? It's just getting a lot of work out there, however it's done. And, I'm not trying to compare my band's talent to a world-class guitarist like Buckethead. I mean, he's a guitar legend and is unique and mysterious in his own way, maybe even more so than Jandek. What I am saying is that if my band hadn't quit and now had 1,000 albums and Buckethead had his 500, we would still be ahead by a factor of 2. That's all I'm saying. And one more thing about Buckethead. I can't help but notice we've never seen Buckethead in the same room as the representative from Corwood. So it kind of makes you think, doesn't it? So there you have it, folks. We dipped into the pool of the avant-garde with Houston's own Jandek, a mysterious guy who is still pretty mysterious when you think about it. He is in the spotlight now, but we never have gotten any insight into his motivations, into his inner world, why he started this, what he's hoped to gain from it, and whether he thinks he has, or what he thinks of his considerable backlog. But you know what? When the guy is on stage, he seems genuinely happy, and he's clearly receiving plenty of love and support from his dedicated fans. As a musician and a performer in general, there really is nothing else. So all the best to the representative in all his future endeavors. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, the show that isn't afraid to get all artsy and sophisticated. In fact, we're now working on a highly personal piece featuring a series of compositions that Andy Hamilton of The Wire calls a wholly baffling and intriguing listen. Yes, we skillfully employ contact mics, jaw harps, melodicas, slide whistles, bass clarinets, feedback loops, treated and untreated pianos, and 130 feet of repurposed Orangeburg sewer pipe to provide lively counterpoint to circuit-bent rhythms from vintage 1970 Fisher-Price toys. It's disposable, playful, intermittently brilliant, and resembles nothing so much as Diamanda Gallus reinterpreting Herb Alpert in an atmosphere filled with mescaline. As always, thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.